thought I'd give a little background on his father. His father was king, and his name was Escher Hadden. And he was described as very paranoid and brought knowing what was going on to a new level. Afraid of false reports, and scribes to Babylonia. When he couldn't take the original reports, he settled for copied documents. So this is during the time period of the 8th century BC, known as the Neo-Assyrian period. It wasn't just Ashur Hadden that was collecting documents, but other nations were as well. For someone as paranoid as he was, he wanted to guard the country. He consulted about the future with spiritual leaders, those with knowledge of the supernatural, or by diviners. In that way, he kept grip on power. So he dies, and he appoints not his very eldest son was a sickly person, and the next in line was a brother, and for reasons unknown, he was not chosen to be king. Instead, he chose Ashurbanipal, and we can only assume that he saw qualities in him that would ensure that he would be a superb person and king to take his place, and so to succeed him. So he was known as a warrior, a scholar, an empire builder, a king slayer, lion hunter, librarian, and he was the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal. The empire of Ashurbanipal, when he came to rule, stretched from Cyprus to the west to Iran in the east. And at one point it included Egypt. The capital was Nineveh in present-day Iraq, and the Greek city-states, Athens and Sparta, were in their infancy. Rome was just a small settlement. He himself called himself king of the world. So back in 2018, the library in Great Britain created the Ashurbanipal Library Project. It was finished in 2018. It's one of the most fascinating and remarkable discoveries that have ever been made. Over a period of many years, cuneiform inscriptions were excavated by the British Museum. In its day, this Ashurbanipal Library Project was the biggest and most wide-ranging collection of texts that had ever been assembled. And in fact, prior to Ashurbanipal's library, there had been libraries, but they were small, and what they contained wasn't, was more record keeping and what was going on. And that was done on cuneiform tablets, cuneiform being a writing style used with a stylus and cubic in form and done on wet clay that would then dry. The tablets were then stored. I don't know, maybe somebody else does, how it was determined that back in the 1850s, an archaeologist even set upon looking for that library. Nevertheless, work continued. As I had said earlier, Ashurbanipal wasn't destined for the throne. And so actually his father, Escher Hadden, followed the same pathway, and he made his younger son, Shamash-shum-kin, king of Babylon, while his younger son, Ashurbanipal, was made king. And his comment was, Ashurbanipal, at the command of the great gods, my father greatly preferred me over the assembly of my elder brothers. It's, I think, safe to say that he had a very high opinion of himself. The name Ashur itself means creator of the air. Ashurbanipal started training to be king after he was appointed crown prince. He learned etiquette, military schools, and skills, and instructed in scholarship. He shadowed his father, learning ways of Assyrian kingship. He also worked as a spy master, gathering intelligence from agents across the empire. This way, he always knew what plots might have been in store for him. Unlike his father, who was satisfied in having the wealth of tablets copied, Ashurbanipal would not settle for copies. He took original documents, including from the palace of Nabu. Nabu was the last king of the Neo-Babylonians. He was considered a god of writing, a scribe. He was also an archaeologist and an agriculturalist. He also wore a helmet in all the depictions that you see of him, and it was thought that his knowledge was acquired through this helmet. He led the kingdom of Babylon until his death in 556 BC. Ashurbanipal was bold, and although he was a warrior, it was said that he never left his home. He hunted lions, which was part of his military training. He rode cavalry horses, chariots, and developed his skills. Assyrian lion hunting was a royal sport. By killing lions, it was evident that he would be able to protect his kingdom against anything that was wild and dangerous. And he says, I pierced the throats of raging lions, each with a single arrow. Interestingly, along with his bow and his arrow in his belt, he kept a stylus. While he was a raging warrior, he was also a man of books. He was popular among his subjects, but ruthless dealing with enemies. During that time period, it was most natural to kill one's enemies, and mostly men. Civilians were not particularly singled out. Ashurbanipal was different. He not only killed his enemies, but he also killed women. And his most horrifying murder was that of a pregnant woman. He was said to have put not a fox chain, a dog chain through the jaw of a defeated king and made him live in a kennel. He inherited a war with Egypt and neighboring regions, each time destroying enemies and building his empire. When the state of Elam rose up, Ashurbanipal crushed them. Back in the first slide, he's sitting with his wife. Let's see if we can go back. No, in the very first slide, there is a relief with him sitting with his wife in a garden setting. One of the people who he murdered, one of the leaders of another kingdom who he murdered, he then hung his head on a tree in the garden. Ashurbanipal's brother, as I had said earlier, had been created king of Babylon. Although their father said that they were equal brothers, Shamukin always had to answer to Ashurbanipal. And what had happened initially, while everything had been quiet and had been going well, his brother was very jealous of his younger brother's position as king, and he revolted, taking contested cities in the name of Babylon. When Ashurbanipal discovered the plot, he laid siege to Babylon for 2 years. And again, horrific stories. Shamukin went back to his palace, and it had been burned, and he chose to die by fire. His co-conspirators were also killed. And Ashurbanipal says, as for the rest of the people, those still alive, I myself now laid flat those people there as a funerary offering. I fed their dismembered flesh that should be to dogs, pigs, vultures, eagles, birds of the heaven, and fish of the Apsu. On to the library, which is one of the most important archaeological discoveries ever made. There's collection, actually the original in its totality, it's thought that there were actually 100,000 clay tablets and fragments inscribed with cuneiform, a type of writing that was used in Mesopotamia. And before that, in the ancient kingdoms, the kingdom of Akkadi, of the Akkadians, and of the Sumerians. As I say, the tablets were discovered in the ruins of Nineveh when this empire collapsed. They were excavated from the 1840s through the 1930s. As I said earlier, I don't know, maybe someone else does, how it came to be that archaeologists even went there searching. So even so, there was much that was found. There was scholarly literature and archives that Nineveh burned down around 612 BC, but the empire did not fall from within. It was actually outsiders who contributed to its fall. It wasn't the leaders who succeeded Ashurbanipal. They were totally competent. At any rate, the fire did not destroy the clay tablets. It actually baked them even harder. Thus, they became the best preserved documents from thousands of years of Mesopotamian history. Prior to that, all that was known of that time period was in the Bible and some tablets that were written by scribes. The library is actually referred to, and this is the Huanjik, I don't know how to pronounce it. It's actually the place where the tablets were found. Presently, no one knows what constituted a library, how many there might have been, and which tablets belong there. The label applies to a wide variety of documents excavated in locations across the mound of Koyunjik. Until the Library of Alexandria, this was the most significant library of antiquity. When the Assyrian objects arrived in the UK, it caused a sensation. One person, so we're going back now into the later 1800s, one person who got swept up in this great sensation was a banknote engraver. And he went to the library every single day the British Museum, into the library every single day at his lunch hour, and he studied every book available on Assyria. And he got the dream of a job of a lifetime when the museum asked that he bring some order to the collection by rejoining fragments of the tablets. Interestingly, while doing so, he found a story about a great flood, just like the biblical story of Noah. Eventually, in the ruins of Nineveh, he found a fragment that helped fill the gap, actually from an even older version of the flood story. All of this is available online, and way back I have the link so that you need not go to the British Museum in order to hear what is on these tablets. A couple of points that I wanted to tell you about is that the library was organized into 3 categories. The first was literary composition, such as divinations, rituals, epics, religious, mythological, medical, lexical, mathematical, as well as myths and epics, including Gilgamesh, the epics of Gilgamesh, and folk tales that later on became 1001 Nights, and in English, the Arabian Nights. The library is organized in 3 categories. And the languages again, and he was able to speak, there were a mix of Sumerian and Akkadian, and Ashurbanipal was able to read and write and speak both of those languages. The second group of tablets is organized in the category legal tablets, and the last category were administrative documents, contracts, tax collections, which was important in knowing how the state functioned. So again, he took these original documents. Despite the fact that he was a hardened warrior, he focused on books. He claimed to have been able to read obscure language. His father impressed upon him that being scholarly was essential, and in this way, he'd always know what was going on in kingdoms surrounding Assyria. He had a revolutionary opinion of himself. He believed himself equal to and we're not using God in the traditional sense that we know it today, but of the different gods that were also held status in Egypt. He knew what was celestial and terrestrial importance. He was knowledgeable in astrology and consulted astrologists. He knew stories before the flood, and he also could do complicated mathematics that had no answers. Another thing that he did that had not been done before, he altered some of the original texts. And finally, it was the Babylonians and Medes that destroyed Nineveh after the death of Ashurbanipal a number of years later.
One thing is that Ashurbanipal, as you said, was very educated man, could read and write. You know, this was very unusual even for the kings, because in those days there was a special group of people, special class of people, scribes, who could read and write. It was very complicated art. So it was very unusual for a king to devote his time to learn that skill. So he supposedly could speak and write on a few languages. Yeah, just I wanted to say that after the death of Ashurbanipal, the kingdom started to disintegrate, and one of the officials, Nabopolassar, eventually grabbed the power in Babylon in opposition to the king. And at that time, the king Cyaxares of Media started to advance. They had a treaty with Babylon to attack Assyria, and in 613 they started between 613 and 611. Eventually they captured, mostly it was Median forces under Cyaxares, King Cyaxares, and so you would know King Cyaxares is the great grandfather of Cyrus the Great. There is a connection there. So they captured the capital of Assyrian Empire, Nineveh, and they burned it. So from there on, the capital of the Assyrian Empire moved to the city called Haran, which is way to the west in Syria, and it was pursued eventually to that area by mostly Babylonian forces at this point, and Egyptian forces, who was basically client king to Assyrian Empire at the time, because they were conquered by Ashurbanipal's father Escher Hadden. So they came in support, but they were defeated in 605, 606, 605 BCE, and that was the end of Assyrian Empire. So the other thing I wanted to mention, that Nineveh was a location outside of the contemporary city Mosul. We probably heard it with all the news in the war in Iraq. And the location of Nineveh was well known through the Middle Ages. So the English explorer, Austin Layard, started excavation in 1849 and found palace of Sennacherib, which is a grandfather of Ashurbanipal. And he found a number of clay tablets there as well, and that's kind of prompted the interest. And later discoveries, there were more archaeological discoveries made in the area, and eventually they found the palace, which is nearby the palace of Ashurbanipal. Once they got those tablets removed from there to London, unfortunately, all of them were mixed between Sennacherib Palace and Ashurbanipal Palace. But yeah, it was anyway tremendous find, tremendous library.
I was going to make a comment. The inherent nature of the clay tablets is when you bake them, they last a lot longer. what normally happened, they've got correspondence between, I think it's Assyrian kings going back to about 2500 BC. They were writing letters back and forth and communicating. I don't know if the kings wrote the thing themselves or whether they dictated to scribes, possibilities. But inevitably, people visited these cities, slaughtered everybody, stacked their skulls up into a pyramid, and burned the place. And this baked the clay tablets. And this is why we have a lot of information on them.
So one of the things that I was going to say was that that's true. There were tablets going back, and as you say, 2,500 years ago. And it would have been scribes who would have done the writing. It would have, and of course, whoever it was that wanted the message to be written down would dictate.
Hi. Yeah, I'd like to know about the cuneiform, the tablets. How much is it so far has been deciphered, or they can read these tablets? I know that in the past they've tried and they've deciphered some of the tablets, but with the technology today, I'm just wondering how far advanced, how much, will they be able to read some more of the tablets?
Well, you see, Alan, it was the cuneiforms were deciphered around more than 100 years ago. There is a rock in Zagros Mountains, which is in Persia right now. It's called Behistun Rock. It's a tremendous rock in the mountains where Darius the First, we're talking about 5th century BCE, wrote proclamations in a few languages. It is very similar to the way they deciphered Egyptian hieroglyphs. They were written in cuneiform, and they also were written in the alphabetic language, Aramaic language. So they were able to read the text and apply it to cuneiforms because Persians still used cuneiforms at the time. And that way they deciphered basically cuneiform writing back then. I'm sure it was improved with times. So they, it's not the cuneiforms and the language that what they use, Assyrian or Akkadian. It's a form of Akkadian language. It's a syllabic language. It's not as precise as alphabetic language. So, it's not precise, translation, but it's most of it pretty close. So they do understand. It's pretty well. I hope that answers your question.
Another thing here. I just posted a link. I just posted a book, The Writing Revolution by Amalia E. I can't pronounce that. It's all about writing systems that starts from the early cuneiforms right through to the Cherokee syllabary and stuff like that. I think most of the cuneiform was either done in Sumerian, which they translated, or they were done in some sort of Semitic language. So they can basically make sense of those things when they encounter them. The problem they have is they encounter other languages where the language is dead. They don't know, like in the case of the Etruscans, they just the language doesn't have roots. They don't know anything about it. And same thing with the Minoans, where it was not these weren't Indo-European languages. They don't know what they're related to, so they can't try. I think cuneiform is pretty manageable.
Yeah. If you don't know the language, then even if you know the system, you can't read it because you don't understand. That's the problem. But Assyrian language was still understandable at the time, and also the Persian language was used in deciphering it, because he wrote in Persian language in cuneiforms and in Aramaic script. So that's how they, and eventually they did, the language survived. We still have Assyrians even alive right now, even though it's very different. But yeah, it's pretty well translated from Assyrian language. Yeah, but the dead languages, of course, that never reached us. Yeah, we can't. Yeah.
Well, the tricky thing there is they also continued using the Sumerian language was dead, but they continued using it well into the first millennium BC. So
yeah, but they used it mostly as a songs, as a sacred songs. They really, they really didn't understand a lot of it, and the language from Akkadian language and eventually Assyrian, the way they developed. I remember from previous discussions, is that they took the first syllable of Sumerian word, and that's how they created the syllables for the Akkadian, the Semitic language. Sumerian was not a Semitic language, but that's how they created the syllables for the language.
I was surprised at the translation of the name Asher as the maker of air, and I was wondering what language that came from. I'm no linguist, but I would not have thought that in a Semitic language it would have a meaning anything related to that. But maybe that's from Persian, or I don't know. I don't.
No, but
Ashur
was the main god of Assyrians. That's and that's, by the way, that their first capital was Ashur. So it's their main god. So it's pretty Assyrian.
They
what language was that? What language was Assyrian the language?
Assyrian, yes, Assyrian is the language, and was developed from Akkadian language.
Right. I was just going to say that. They also, their main god was Shamash, which was the god of the sun. And so also in creation stories in Egypt, you also had, they may have had different names, but of course there was the biggest of all, and that was the god of the sun. But
so that's a very Semitic word. I mean, the Hebrew
Right.
word for the sun is today,
But
is Shamash.
yeah, but Assyrian is the Semitic language.
Right.
Assyrian and Akkadian, they're both
I
Semitic
see. I
group
see. I
of
did not realize
languages.
it.
there,
Thank you.
but prior to, time-wise, the Akkadian and Sumerian were prior to the development, I think, of Semitic languages.
No.
Or-
What we know, Semitic languages right now, they're in that group, in the same group, and there are a lot of similarity with
Yes.
the Hebrew and the.
Right.
I would just wanted to answer Ellen's question about the tablets. That work is still going on. And one of the issues that comes up is money. Someone has to fund the project at the British Museum so that those who are involved, archaeologists included, can go back to that area or be able to spend so much time trying to decipher. What fascinated me, and wow, I would really love to read it. And I saw that one of the viewers is actually going to the UK, so it would be great to go to that gallery of the British Museum. And that's the fascinating flood story that appears in more than one place. I mean, not and I'm not talking about the biblical flood, but here's another example that was written down, not an example, but a story of this flood.
Yeah. Be careful there. On Rational Wiki, there's an article about flood myths, and apparently Japanese don't have a flood myth. And some Japanese have defined themselves as racially superior because they don't have a flood myth. I think this probably reflects the fact that ancient civilizations are all built in watersheds, and if you don't run your watershed properly, it floods.
Yeah, hi. Regarding the flood, I know in the Asian culture, they also recorded the Great Flood at around the same time. So it's similar stories. So it might be, true, because it's also recorded in the Asian cultures. And then, so that was my comment. The second question I have is when we say the Assyrian, this cuneiform, this language is a dead language, and then I hear we were just discussing how the Semitic language kind of comes from the Assyrian language. My question is, if there's an influence on the Semitic language today from the Assyrians, is there any influence regarding culture-wise or history-wise that also influence that the Assyrians have some sort of influence on the Semitic culture later?
Well, I don't know if it's worth anything, but if you know that in the Bible they said that Abraham came from city of Ur, which is right there in Mesopotamia. That's where this, that's in terms of cultural, the idea of Semitic languages is not like they existed anytime. It's just that the scientists saw similarities between the languages, certain languages. They saw similarities and they grouped them in a certain way because they were a lot of similarities. So obviously that Mesopotamia is an earlier kind of civilization that developed writing. It's one of the it's probably the earliest. Well, maybe Egypt. They're just very similar in terms of timing, though Mesopotamia seemed to be a couple hundred years ahead. So yeah, definitely they had an influence because at some point the early Assyrian language, because this is the Neo-Assyrian Empire, but there was an old Assyrian Empire, a mid-Assyrian Empire, and it's developed from the Akkadian empires. All of these empires, they encompassed huge territories, and the Assyrian language for a long time has been a lingua franca through this whole area, and definitely have influenced many languages.
Greg, can I ask you a question? You see the map here, can you maybe just go over the map and basically maybe just give a two-minute explanation who is who, and then how the Assyrian relates to the other nations, or where they are, and then
But I don't know how am I gonna use this map.
Well, actually, I was under the impression that Semitic languages are apparently Ethiopia is just crawling with Semitic languages and dialects. The thing almost certainly came out of Africa, and there's probably something similar to the Indo-European Aryan War of Conquest. They swept out and dominated countries. And
well, I don't know about the language. I don't know about the languages and how they spread, but certainly in terms of writing system, that's definitely came from Mesopotamia. But as far as languages, how they develop, but usually the superior culture does influence in terms of language because it develops very new terminology, and Mesopotamia was certainly a superior culture. On the map, as you see this green thing, this was the crescent, and these are the area. Assyria okay, Egypt was first conquered by Assyria at the time of Escher Hadden, which is the father of Ashurbanipal. We're talking around maybe 700, and so the beginning of the 7th century BCE. Prior to that, Egypt was not conquered by except Hyksos, but we don't really know much about them, what culture they represented. But so the crescent was actually included the what we know as Israel, Lebanon, Syria, a part of the southeastern Turkey, and Mesopotamia. That was the area where a lot of trades was going on during the Assyrian Empire. So it's definitely influenced the languages.
John Maloney would have a lot to say about these ancient languages. It's too bad he isn't here, but you could easily find him on YouTube, on the YouTube channel, and his discussion of ancient languages and their relationships. And in fact, there's a chart that's used by linguists that groups, not the language itself, but I don't know the exact word, but for example, the regions where the languages developed. And at any rate,
I appreciate that.
It's a way of grouping language origins. Am I right? I mean, is that, how would you describe it? When John talks about languages in antiquity.
I would suggest people look into the YouTube videos on our channel, History of Fitness Investing, all 3 words together. And there's 6 different distinct lectures on Semitic languages, and actually 1 lecture on Sumerian language. And we talk about as detailed as, as alphabet and how to read certain things, obviously on the rudimentary basic level. But to the Beverly's words, there's a chart that shows that Semitic languages, in current Hebrew, for example, Aramaic, is part of the Semitic language family, stemming from Akkadian language, that called after the city Akkad, that actually was never found to begin with. Having said that, we actually need to switch gears and come closer to, and Beverly, this was amazing presentation, an amazing discussion. We need to actually now talk about city of Alexandria and the Library of Alexandria. And again, thank you, Beverly, thank you, Howard, thank you, Greg. So the second part of our presentation is the city of Alexandria. So what's the importance of the city of Alexandria, and what is the importance of the library? And then therefore, we're going to talk about the destruction of the aforementioned. Long before the splendor and the beauty of the libraries, such as Strahov Monastery, a library in Prague, or Trinity College library in Dublin, we had this library called, City of Alexandria, which was initially 2,000 years ago. The city was, founded by Alexander the Great, who, believe it or not, envisioned the library, grandiosity of this library, through collecting various works throughout the world, and either keep the originals or the copies of the originals within that library. But he never was able to see the light of this library. As you know, Alexander the Great had passed. And I would like for Howard to explain, who Ptolemy was, and then what was the importance of the city of Alexandria. Go ahead, Howard.
Okay. Basically, didn't have a lot of time to get ready for this. Basically, Alexander the Great died in 323 BC. his family and his generals all fought over the succession. These are known as the Wars of Diadochi, or successors, and nobody really won it. The generals killed off all the members of the Alexander's families kill each other off pretty well. Then the generals finish off what was left. And then they fought with each other, and the whole empire broke up into separate kingdoms. There was a Seleucid Empire. There was one in what is now Persia. There was one in Anatolia, what is now Turkey. There was a couple guys in Greece, and Ptolemy managed to capture Egypt. Ptolemy apparently grew up with Alexander. It's claimed that his mother was impregnated by Philip II, although the consensus seems to be that's not likely. But he scored Egypt, and he managed to hang on to it, and he managed to pass on to successors, and that was the final Egyptian dynasty. The Ptolemy the First was known as Soter, which translates to savior, and I did a quick search and I couldn't find an explanation for that. He was a Macedonian general. Unlike the other Macedonians, he's able to establish a stable succession, or much more stable succession than anybody else managed to do anyway, which is not saying much. And he was a historian. He apparently wrote a book on the Alexandrian Wars that apparently was considered pretty good. And of course, none of it survives. And he was the guy that started the Library of Alexandria. They think his successors, he started it. I think it was his son, Ptolemy II, that did most of the actual building.
So thank you so much. So as it was explained to you, Ptolemy was connected to Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great dream was to, collect as many works of writing and translate them into Greek and store them in this library, Alexandria, basically. And the inspiration that he's received is from the library of Ashurbanipal. When he went to Assyria and Nineveh, at that time, Nineveh obviously was already in ruins. He was actually surprised to see, as had Beverly mentioned, there was over 100 clay tablets, 100,000 clay tablets, currently thought of about 30,000 had survived, but at the time was 100,000 clay tablets that was available to him. And he obviously was surprised and wanted to build something like this. And then at the time, obviously they had already developed papyrus in Egypt. It was at the helm of developing the most advanced papyrus there is. And then just a little bit of explanation, what is Alexandria? As you can think of it, they still have indigenous population of the Egyptians that lived there, but the cream of the crops of bourgeoisie, upper class, was Macedonian Greeks, not just any Greeks, not the Athenian Greeks, Macedonian Greeks from Macedon, who actually was all of his generals. And basically they wanted to develop a cultural capital outside of Memphis. Memphis was the capital of Egypt. They wanted to develop the capital, and one of the things that they want to do is to collect books. Okay, let's go to the next. All right, so you see pictures here on the left. This is how the library, which we saw a little bit of a picture, a lot of a movie, how a library would have looked. You have a bunch of papyruses, parchments, books. In the middle, you have obviously, what had been survived, the writings and how the work was conducted. On the right, it's something called Serpas. Serpas was a sister library of a major Alexander the Great library, because they had such a surplus of works that they were able to collect, that they had to build another library. And this is a remaining archaeological discovery. And on the bottom, you see the Alexandria, Alexandria city, basically. While they're residing at the library, while people and the scientists reside at the library, they were actually provided lodging so they can do scientific discoveries. And we'll talk about how they were able to do that, right? The meals will provide the scientists, scholars, the writers, the translators, and even servants were provided solely so they can focus on the research which was conducted in geometry, anatomy, mathematics, I mean, it was such a variety of studies that were done. It was first basically, you would think of the university research centers, so to speak. And so basically, this library was developed and built by Ptolemy first, Ptolemy second, and Ptolemy third. Ptolemy, I don't pronounce correctly. All right, let's move on to the next one. All right, so I've already mentioned, Alexandria, obviously located in Egypt, is one of the greatest cities. They tried to build it away from Memphis, which I'm mentioning. Founded by, the library was founded by Ptolemy, but it was Alexander the Great dream. There was over 700,000 scrolls filled in the shelves. It became lost to history, and then we'll get to the point where Howard will explain how it was lost to the history and what was important to it. So it's sometimes of the understatement to say that the history of the library's construction is somewhat cloudy, with various conflicting texts exist in exactly when it was built. So there's so many writings to when it was built, how it was built. So the most importantly, it was dedicated to Ptolemy, the second and third. But we're really not certain. Maybe it was built in succession, it was built later, but Ptolemies are the ones that credited with building it. All right, let's move on to the next. So one of the things that Ptolemy was credited with is building something called museum, which is actually a predecessor to something we call a museum right now. So Ptolemy founded the museum, which is a Greek means shrine, right? Shrine to the muses, which is the to praise the Greek gods, and mostly it's praise the Greek god of artistry and scholarship. So they basically was praising to a muse of the particular Greek goddess. The word museum would eventually become more familiar with the word museum, obviously. Museum was a research institute with laboratories, lecture halls, gardens, guest rooms, communal dining halls for scholars who were visiting Alexandria on generously funded academic and religious expeditions in their search for knowledge. So basically, it was come here and research and do your work. We'll provide all the means for you to do that. While residing at the library, they would get lodgings of meals, even servants, so that the scholars' main focus was be solely on research and progressions of their work and content, and increasing the content of the library. Let's move on. All right, so Library of Alexandria was first stop for many of the city's visiting philosophers, poets, scientists, mathematicians, even Roman emperors. The city became intellectual capital of the world, with rumors of the over 500,000 works being stored within its walls. It seems within the research center, Ptolemy inadvertently created the first model of the university campus. And we'll get into the works that was connected. Books arrangements, and then we'll talk about the who was at the helm of arranging books in a particular catalog mission within the Alexandria. Ptolemaic dynasty went to extreme length in order to secure the precious knowledge that would fill their most prestigious of libraries. How did they do it? How did they collect all the books? To accumulate the writings and text, they undertook various methods. Some are very conventional, some are unconventional. One of the conventional ones, they purchased books, right? So basically, they went to the city market and they went to Athens, Rhodes, and they purchased books. Second was more unconventional. They basically, saw the ships docking, and they would search the ships for the books, and they confiscate them. Sometimes they confiscate, they make a copy, and they provide, highly, high-tech papyrus copy to the owner, and they keep the originals. Or sometimes they will just keep the copy. Mostly they'll keep the originals. So obviously, the Greeks in Athens had an issue with that. So the way to accomplish that, Ptolemy paid in silver to Athens scholars and kept a lot of very interesting works within the Alexandria libraries, but we'll get into that. Also, although the method was frowned upon of how they confiscate the books, it achieved an aim of expanding the library collection of knowledge all around the globe. Another notable tale is that Ptolemy even managed to acquire the official editions of tragedies of Euphrates, Sophocles, and Achilles, which at the time were kept safe in Athenian state archives and never lent out, especially for the purposes which the Ptolemy dynasty had in mind. Despite the Ptolemy III bargained a huge sum of silver as a deposit on a safe return to the archives, the Athenians were understandably infuriated when copies of their precious works were returned, albeit on the finest papyrus paper available at the time. And originals remained in the library of Alexandria for safekeeping, and large amount of silver that was forfeited was perhaps the sum that King Dov pouring in order to secure this most precious text. So he paid them in silver and said, just shut up, I'll keep the originals. Unsung hero of the library was Callimachus. Callimachus was a librarian, right? So he's developed a system where he compiled over 120 volumes of cataloging every book, scroll, parchments, manuscripts in a feat that is incredible to think of. With the tools available to the sheer numbers of various works that populated the library at the time. Without this incredible organization, the scientists wouldn't be able to make the discoveries that they made. And let me talk about the discoveries in a second. So one of the discoveries, if you know about Copernicus, in 1800s, he discovered, obviously, the major discovery was, the world was round. But apparently, the Greek astronomer and philosopher Aristarchus placed the sun at the center of the universe, creating a first heliocentric model of the solar system, a truly astonishing feat, only possible to the funding and knowledge made available by the Ptolemies. That's 2,000 years earlier. Also, the first use of the word geography happened under the roof of library by Greek mathematician, poet, and astronomer and geographer Aristanius. Alongside the achievements, he was the first person to calculate a circumference of the Earth that was round, as well as inventing the system of longitude and altitude. Founder of trigonometry, Hipparchus, also was at the library, spent his time cataloging the stars and managed to calculate the length of the solar year within 6.5 minutes accuracy, getting in the label as the greatest astronomer of the time. Elements was he basically developed a geometrical book based on that. Scientific dissection of the human body, in which Herophilus was able to identify the brain as a controlling organ of the body, was made as a discovery in the library. He's considered the first anatomist to use valuable research, paved the way for future generation of medical professionals. Greek mathematician, engineer, hero of Alexandria, is known as inventing a window wheel. Hero of Alexandria, his name, harnessing wind on land for the first time, also inventing steam power via utilization of the heat in the water. One of the more familiar scholars in history was Archimedes. And we call him Mr. Eureka, obviously. And he worked at the library. Also Galen. Galen was one of the first anatomists as well, healing, basically developing healing systems and, for medical world, and one of the first real doctors, so to speak. Library also featured prominent female of a mathematical, her name is Hypatia, who was a teacher of astronomy and Neoplatonist philosophy. And one of the most important works he did, he gathered 72 men from various Israeli tribes and had them translate the Old Testament from Hebrew to Greek. And it was all done in 72 days. So you can imagine, Torah was translated in 72 days from Aramaic or Hebrew into Greek in the library. All right, I just wanted to show Aristides and Hippophilus, who was anatomists and mathematicians. All right, so there is a couple of interesting theories of how the library was destroyed. So I will probably turn to my friend Howard, and I will start with the first theory, which was, and then Howard will mention it. Go ahead.
Okay, I didn't research these carefully. There was a couple other interesting claims. Basically, there was lots of warfare going in Egypt, and people conquered Alexandria at various times. And conquest of a city is not a peaceful process. Things get burned. At some point, Julius Caesar was trapped in was holed up in the Alexandrian palace. And the Egyptians attacked him, and there was all kinds of stuff got burned and stuff like that. That's the best of my knowledge. I didn't look this one up carefully. You realize it's not like it survived. The library completely survives every attack except one. Shit happens. Somebody, they wouldn't have careless smoking back then, but there's lots of other ways to stupidly start a fire.
What happened at the time of the entrapment? The Caesar decided to attack the Alexandrian fleet with some of the ships he had, and there was a naval battle where Roman ships fired some of the Alexandrian ships, and they were next to the docks, and that's how the fire spread that damaged the library. But it was not fully destroyed. I mean, there was some stuff was burned, but it was only partial damage.
Yeah,
you're absolutely right, Greg. Just to add to it, Howard, please admit people. It's very questionable whether he had destroyed, obviously, the original library, because the docks only warehoused the books that were surplus. They were not the original works. They were just basically copies, and they would, and even the ones that are not very important works were warehoused in next to the docks. But they say most of the works had survived. Greg is correct. So let's go to the next theory. So history records that on 391 AD, Emperor Theodosius issued a decree that would sanction the demolition of Alexandria temples and wipe out any last vestige of the paganism. So extensive eradication of historically important literature. So obviously, the Alexandria library had contained many pagan writings, or the ones that worship different gods that would not agree with the Christian religion, and therefore Theodosius decided that he would destroy it. On top of it, there was a leader, his name is Theophilus, who led a devastating assault on the library, basically destroying anything and everything inside. And then Theophilus finished. He ordered a church to be built, in the place where the Seraphinus was. Remember, Seraphinus was a sister library that was built to house the surplus, works. And so that's that.
The thing is that at least at the time of Emperor Theodosius, that's when it's all happened because of the religious. What they have destroyed, they've destroyed Serpas at the time. Serpas, that's where the overflow of the library books were stored. However, the library was destroyed prior to that. And if I may kind of tell that story, that the library, the complete destruction of the library itself happened at the time of Emperor Aurelian. in the year of 272. So it was at the time of what they call uprising of the Palmyra. Palmyra, as you know, the city in Syria. It was Arabian city, was ruled by the Queen Zenobia, and she started uprising with her husband, who was killed, and she continued this, and eventually Aurelian came to power prior to that, and he was one of the very few able emperors. This is the time of the what we call crisis of the 3rd century in the Roman Empire. So he ruled between 270 and 275. He quelled the uprising. The Palmyrese forces invaded Egypt and captured Alexandria. And at this point, Romans with Aurelian put a siege, and they destroyed one of the district of Alexandria. That's where the library is. And at that time, the library burned completely. And that is considered to be the final destruction of the library. However, a number of books remained in the Serpas, which is the temple of the Serpas, which was in slightly different location. And that later on destruction of the books that took place there.
One up. I've got the Vanished Library by Luciano Canfora here, and I went through that and mentioned a couple other alternate explanations. They mentioned Queen Zenobia and Aurelian fighting back. Basically, the city changed hands several times. He also mentions that the Roman Emperor Diocletian besieged Alexandria in response to an Egyptian revolt. I was looking this one up. Canfora describes Alexandria as completely sacked. I looked at Wikipedia, they don't mention sacking and burning. So if anything survived Zenobia and Aurelian, Diocletian had a crack at it.
Yeah, but
That was
it was not
part of the Christians.
No, but that was not
No.
Christian. It was not an intentional destruction at all, like with Caesar. Even at the time of Aurelian, it was not an intentional destruction, unlike the later on at the time of Theodosius the First, which was like the religious grounds. As a matter of fact, Diocletian, who came later, like maybe 15 years later, after the Aurelian, he actually prosecuted Christians, and yes, he did also take Alexandria, but it is mostly believed that by that time the library didn't exist, but he didn't touch the Serpas. Serpas was still intact with whatever scrolls remained there.
I didn't have a lot of time to do research. I did a fast read, and I don't have a clear picture. Like sacking a city is not a peaceful, non-destructive process.
Right. Sure.
All right,
But
let's move on. We'll discuss the rest. To make history even more confusing, it's written that during the Muslim conquest of Alexandria in around 642 AD, what remained of the library suffered a further, destruction, with writings of religious subjects, satellite, and world losing even more its invaluable knowledge the library at once contained. So that's even on top of that.
It's very interesting. At the time when part of the library, part of those scrolls were burned, I'm talking about the Caesar's time, right? So when Mark Antony came to power and married Cleopatra, he decided to make a very interesting move. The second library in the Greco-Roman world at the time, and the most important library, was the library of the Pergamon. So this was another very famous and the very thorough library. So Mark Antony made a present of 200,000 rolls of documents from Pergamon library into Alexandrian library to replenish what was burned, and probably even more, than just replenish, as a present to Cleopatra. So, and so at that time, Alexandrian library was huge. They say that a few generations later, it was returned, but who knows? That's another interesting part to it.
So thank you, Greg. So just kind of like scrolling forward, there is some parchments of the daughter library that remain, and during the Byzantium scholars, what they call tzetis, the daughter library had 42,800 books. That's 12th century AD. And somewhat internal court had about 400,000 mixed and 90 unmixed books, and so forth, so on. Just kind of skim through. Why did it decline? Remember, I mentioned that there was a royal pedigree to help researchers do their work within the library, and they call them obviously museums. And the funding and the interest in libraries had declined. I mean, because of the fact that there was a change of power, and Ptolemy was one of the interested factions. But with Cleopatra dying, that was the last descendant of the Ptolemy, and therefore, it kind of, the interest had ceased, further. And I just want to get to the last part. Although there was many written accounts regarding the library's life and death, the lack of any primary sources leaves more myth and mystery than fact. Many accounts compete with each other. Obviously, archaeologists found the remains of the Serapis, which would leave some evidence of the building that supposedly housed some library collections. It leaves to imaginations what could have been if those precious historical texts survived through modern days. So that's the end of my presentation. Any questions?
Yeah, there was a question about the lighthouse of Alexandria. The reason why was it the wonder of the world? So all the 7 wonders of the world was something extraordinary. The lighthouse of Alexandria was something that has never been built before in terms of the size and how far it projected the light. It was something extraordinary, and also the beauty of it, aesthetic beauty. It was built on an island, and that's one of the reasons those wonders of the world were mentioned, because if you look at a few others, they're just humongous statues, like statue of Heracles, or huge temples, like Temple of Artemis in Ephesus, and Mausoleum of Halicarnassus, which is as you know, Mausoleum was the name of the it's a place where you store the body, but Mazol was the ruler, the king of city of Halicarnassus in Asia Minor, and that was another one. So yeah, it was just one of a kind, the biggest, the most beautiful light. It unfortunately it doesn't exist anymore. There have been a series of earthquakes that destroyed it. I think the end of it was happened in the 14th century earthquake, and but it's been discovered. The remnants of it have been discovered, and with all the statues. It was not just a lighthouse. There were all kinds of like sphinx brought from ancient part of Egypt. There were all kinds of sculptures. It was like really a piece of art.
Yeah, I might have missed some part of the presentation. I'd like to know all the books that are collected. I think I read somewhere it was close to 70,000. Did you say that?
700,000.
700,000. My question regards to that is that how is it possible that so many people were writing books? 700,000 is like a lot of writing, which means you know a lot of people were educated and literate, and also if these collections also contains like foreign languages, because through trade you said that it's a port, there's a lot of trade going on, so they may have also contained literatures or books from other languages. I'm just interested in 700,000 books. How is that possible, when I would believe that people back then were not all of them were educated and literate, and in such a short amount of time to accumulate that many books, 700,000 of them. I'm just curious.
It's not a short period of time. 700,000 probably was a few hundred years later. I mean, the initial accumulation was pretty significant because it was brought from many places. It was a huge empire that Alexander the Great brought, but later on they were accumulated, and it took a few centuries to accumulate that.
Well, define. Okay, number one, you need to define the word book. We're not talking
scrolls. We're talking scrolls. Yeah.
We are, but we're not talking Gone with the Wind, where the scroll could
right
be 2 or 3 feet of it or something like that. It would be called a book. We don't have the record, so we can't confirm the number 700,000. It may be somebody exaggerating. I'm not sure how that works. I know back in the 18th century, if people said there was a whole bunch of things, they said, oh, there are 40,000 of them. So if you're reading circa 1800, somebody uses the number 40,000, you can't take it seriously. I wouldn't know what the number would be in the days of the Library of Alexandria. It could be 700,000.
Well, one of the things that I can answer for sure, Ellen, they had employed the translators. So one of the things that I mentioned, they Bible into Greek. That's a significant amount of books, and that's just a written word. There's also an oral word for Hebrew called Talmud, which also has significant amount of, and then they did it all in 72 days. So the amount of scribes and translators that lived within the library was immense. And they were all paid for. Also scholars like Galen, Epirus, Archimedes lived and worked and wrote books inside the library for years.
I think the general consensus, though, of historians is that the translation into Greek of everything other than the first 5 books of the Hebrew Scriptures dates to much later in history, like a century and a half later. So it couldn't have been those same 72 or 70 people, right, who were doing it in some short period of time. They would have passed by that point.
Another thing here, I've got my copy of Herodotus history here. History's here. In the table of contents, it shows 9 books. So again, the word book might not mean what you think it does.
Yeah, I don't know. All I know is, I mean, I just, if you look at scholarship on this subject, there is this concept of the Pentateuch, which is those 5 books of Moses that was translated in that incident. That's a very famous story of the the 70 or 72 scholars. But then historians seem to look at the rest of the translation into Greek happening in Alexandria 150 years or so later. I don't have a copy of the book. I'll leave it to everyone to research that, but that seems to be the consensus of the historical community.
Nevertheless, it's pretty amazing. 72 days to translate even 5 books.
Absolutely. and have identical verbatim translations, even though there are figures of speech involved. And
That's another one we can't confirm.
You could just speak. I mean, it's pretty amazing that within the city they built two wonders of the world, which is the library and the lighthouse. And the other wonders of the world, they're kind of, I mean, obviously pyramids, but Semiramis gardens.
No, but the library was not considered one of those seven wonders.
It wasn't. Well, they also
It was a wonder, but it was not one of those seven.
Well, who is interpreting it?
No. But we know the seven that they
What
in
were
the
the
ancient
seven?
times. In the
What were the
ancient times, they decided to give 7 wonders of the world. I think library was not one of them. I mean, it certainly was a wonder, but I think they judged them by different criteria. I mean, it had to be like in terms of building, in
So
also
can
sculpture.
you mention all 7 by any chance, or what
Well, the pyramids, the lighthouse, the 2 in the country is already a lot. Then this the Hanging Gardens of Babylon of Pyramid, and then there is a mausoleum of Halicarnassus. There is the Temple of
Diana in
Artemis.
Ephesus.
Artemis in Ephesus, and that's 5. And then there is a
Statue of
temple,
Zeus somewhere in Greece.
Zeus on Olympia, Olympia, and
Colossus of Rhodes. The Colossus of Rhodes.
Exactly, and Colossus of Rhodes. Yes.
Yeah. Which didn't last very long. Now, the thing is, Egypt was probably the richest place in the ancient world. So the guy that controlled Egypt and controlled Alexandria had massive resorts at his display. I'm just pulling out my book, the book Ancient Engineers by Elsprag de Campier. This is a fascinating book. This is a worthwhile read. He mentions that somebody was building giant galleys for one of the Ptolemies. They think the ships were something like 300 feet long. They were absolutely useless. They couldn't maneuver them and they couldn't move them very fast, but presumably it just looked cool paddling up and down the harbor.
Wow.
So they had the resource to do crazy stuff, and they wanted to be famous, and they wanted to put up grand spectacles. So, this stuff happened.
Yeah, even the guy who burned the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus, his name is Gerostat. He became famous. He became part of history. He did it for that same.
Yeah.
Well, but he became famous. I mean, he did it for that same reason. That he said that he burned it because he wanted to become famous and enter the history, and he did. Gerostat. Of course they wanted to, but he came to our times.
Interesting.
I have a question. For the library, during that time, it was built, you said, between 2 centuries, something like that?
No, maybe a library was built maybe like within a couple of generations. I think it's like from 280 to 250, something like this.
And the accumulation of all these books, you said, is between maybe 200 years, right?
Yeah, maybe. I think when they're counting, they're probably counting at the time of already Julius Caesar or something.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure they kept writing stuff between Caesar and Hypatia.
But 700.
There was destruction. Now, I was going to make the point that thing probably went up fairly. You got to watch out. Like, if you go to medieval Europe, they talk about spending 200 years building churches. But that's just because they didn't have resources. The Chateau de Coucy was a monster castle and went up in 7 years. I think if Ptolemy wanted a building put up, it went up fast. It probably went up. It would, wouldn't take weeks, but it would take a couple of years, I would think.
Yeah, they could have expanded it. I mean, they could have built the original one, then they have keep expanding or something.
Yeah,
like
and
that.
you do that because you keep acquiring books. Yeah.
So what do you think about the people back then in that area? Are they mostly educated? Is a library open to the public or only to scholars? Is this considered like some sort of government department or something?
No, It was not for like a library today when people come to read. No, it's not for
Mm.
scholars, and majority of people are not educated.
Okay.
There
I
was
see.
something, I was just,
Interesting.
I'm trying to think of what I was reading. There was something mentioning that Egyptian peasants were not allowed to go into a town for more than 20 days. So they were to be back out in the fields, shoveling shit from one place to another. So there wasn't a lot of, if you go to a place like Greece and Rome, which were set up as democracies and republics, I think there was a high level of education among the population of citizens. But it helps to remember that the people that were citizens were a minority.
True. I mean, it's interesting that Macedonians are thought of this brute nation next to, or just being accepted as being Greeks and barbaric. All of a sudden, they're in Egypt, Alexandria, and they wanted to develop this most sophisticated, libraries. But Alexander the Great was very intelligent, right? He was the Aristotle's pupil, student.
Oh.
So therefore, his idea, it's almost they followed it to a T, where what he wanted to happen did happen, and they were very successful.
Yeah.
I'm sure there was other libraries that tried to do the same thing, and there was a lot of resistance from, especially Athens. They didn't want to give their original works to Alexandria, but
Mhm.
Ptolemy and silver, and I'm sure they had
Yeah.
relations.
But the Athens were already a part of the Macedonian Empire, so I'm not sure they had much of a choice.
They weren't under the control of Ptolemy. They were under the control. Forget that they.
Yeah, they were under
area-
control of Macedonian part.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
Well,
they
no,
could
that-
have. Yeah,
And that area kept changing. Don't forget, they were all Macedonians, but they were at each other's throats.
Correct.
And-
I think they were more,
Um,
even if they were Greeks versus Macedonians, they probably would have found better connection.
Yeah, but
Because of the fact, if you remember when they tried to bring the Alexander the Great sarcophagus back to, Macedonia, Ptolemy ended up, stealing the sarcophagus. And there was a dissension basically that who has the bigger,
it was already the War of Diadochi. I mean, so that was just the beginning of it. So they had started to act out, but they were not at the time. It's just like within a year, it didn't really start. It didn't split into Hellenistic kingdoms yet. But he already established himself in Egypt, not as a king, but as a ruler. As a matter of fact, the first king of Egypt from Macedonian dynasty was Alexander IV, the son of Alexander and Roxanne. I mean, even though he was a child, of course, he couldn't rule, and he was in Pella, in Macedonia, but officially he kind of ruled it, even though Ptolemy had the control, and only like maybe 10 years later, after the kid was killed, I think he only lived to maybe 13, 14 years old. I mean, he never really ruled. Then he officially took the power of Kingdom of Egypt. And in that period of time, I mean, who knows? It was a city of Alexander, and it was Alexander's idea to have the library. I mean, they could have enforced a lot of books being transferred there, even from Macedonia at the time, before the War of Diadochi.
The definition of the word scroll and book. Scrolls were made of papyrus, and papyrus is made out of reeds, which are smashed together and dried. How large a piece could you build or fabricate in one piece? And if it's one piece, is a scroll many pieces joined together, or how do you do that?
Yeah, they join together sometimes.
They can sew them together.
Scrolls. It wasn't just one scroll as a book.
Yeah, they join scrolls together to make it larger.
It wasn't
Yeah, but the thing is, what the terminology here is you've decide to write a book. You decide to write about something. You start and you write, and then you're done, and that's it. You've written a book. It might be 2 feet of scroll. It might be 50 feet of scrolls, or they may break it up into multiple books because you broke it up. You really there's no data from which to do the numerical analysis. Basically, the library had lots of books, had lots and lots of books.
Yeah, and then they were arranged by Callimachus in such a way that scholars and scientists were able to do the research and find the books. And it was actually very impressive with those tools to be able to use this numerical, librarian codes and, collate it correctly so that you only look at, anatomy books or the, the books that talk about math and books that talk about philosophy. And so, and then they also had women scientists, which is pretty unheard of, so it wasn't part of, even though unequal world, but it was kind of an equal. They wanted the scholars, the smart people. They didn't care who you were, as long as you came in and you did the work, and you were able to find what you need to do. What I connected with, I don't know if you guys ever see Game of Thrones, and they have also a collection of the books in one place where they become masters. So they would go to that one place, and actually it resembles Alexandria. I forget the name of the place. They call it Landing or something like that, and where
King's Landing. I've got the whole series.
No, it wasn't King's Landing. It was I forget the name of it, but
it's not at King's Landing. It's another kingdom. It's another place. Yeah.
They came there to study only poisons, or they came there to study how to cure bubonic plague, or how to cure. So, and it was exactly, they had old papyruses everywhere, and people would come into a certain floor and they'll find what they need. And then they also
By the way, when we throw the word book around, be careful here. With in Alexandria, they had scrolls. When you have separate leaves and you sew them together and put covers on, what you have is called a codex. So the word book, strictly speaking, and I'm being really narrow in my definition, the word book can cover either thing.
Yeah, I guess. And by the way, David mentioned here that dividing the parchments made also a book. And by the way, you remember when I was talking about the library of Pergamon? Over there, it was competing library to Alexandria through the ages, but they had no access to Egyptian. They couldn't make those rolls, papyrus. They had no access to papyrus in Egypt, so they developed a new thing to how to write on a parchment. So that was made from the skin of I think goat skin or maybe some other skins, and that's how they created the sheets where they were right, and they could be bind together. That's how the book. So most of this stuff that by the way, Mark Antony brought to Alexandrian Library as a present to Cleopatra, they were parchments, because there were very few papyruses in Pergamon library. As a matter of fact, the form of very thick parchment, I think called pergament, which is from the city of Pergamon.
So one of the slides right here, it explains how the organization of the shelves were. Like, for example, Callimachus' bibliography of Greek literature assembled 8 genres of Greek poetry in 5 prose styles: history, rhetoric, philosophy, medicine, law, miscellaneous, organized alphabetically, short biography, bibliography of the author, the opening words of each work, and indication of the length of the work. So this was pretty elaborate, summarization of the works. So whenever people were looking for something, I would think of it as like using a microfiche. I mean, if people remember microfiche back in the days, if you want to find something, you have to look at the microfiche and before the computers and kind of look to see where the book is located. This was kind of like predecessors of that. So it's interesting, grouping, cataloging, relevant author works. So this was incredible work.
So the catalog has been lost as well. I guess someone would be responsible to catalog each and every single book or scroll that they have, and I guess that list is also gone.
Yeah, everything is gone. It was burned completely. You see, yeah, go ahead.
Greg mentioned vellum, that when they do the sheepskin and stuff, either goat skin or sheepskin, is called vellum. They are recovering ancient writings now by searching for what they call palimpsests. Vellum is expensive as hell. It's a valuable product. And so what people did is they took a vellum with text on it, they scraped off the text and then put new text on it. Typically this was Christians writing down Bibles and stuff like that. So what they do with these things, they look at them and realize that if you really study the thing carefully, you can pick up the original text. And they've actually recovered ancient writings that way. But yeah, I mean, they had no way of backing anything up. The only way you could back anything up back in the day was to sit there and copy it by hand.
Yeah.
So most of just one last quick question. I know it's time. The theories on why the library was destroyed is mostly because of religion or politics.
No, it was during the war. You see, partially, first time it was destroyed during the Julius Caesar story. The other one during the Emperor Aurelian, and then Serpas was destroyed because of the religious reasons, because there was the riots against everything pagan. So multiple reasons.
So it coincided with the rise of the Roman Empire and the Catholic religion?
The Roman Empire. Okay,
I'm trying to get my timeline.
During the first half of the first millennium AD, the Romans absolutely sucked at political stability. The Roman Empire when you read in the 2nd century AD with the 5 good emperors, it looks like Rome was really stable. What the Romans did was they got 5 absolutely top-notch emperors in a row. And that was more of a biological accident than good management. The moment those guys got out of the way, Rome just blew up into a massive civil war. They weren't politically stable. Any Roman emperor was looking over his shoulder and trying desperately to stay alive. Killing emperors is not a peaceful process. Usually there's battles and there's sacking and pillaging and stuff like that. They just weren't politically stable. But I mean, the other thing is we've covered a period of 800 years?
Somewhat that, yeah. Right.
Yeah, shit happens.
Before we continue the conversation, please join us tomorrow if you guys are interested. And it will be a presentation by Dr. Sabil, who is actually a physician by trade, but he is a Muslim cleric. And he's going to talk about Muslim Jesus. If you guys are interested to understand how they interpret Jesus and Muslim religion, so join us tomorrow at 12 p.m. It's on our meetup. Again, he's very nice, and he'll have all the answers. He'll explain what he means. Obviously, we're not here to hate on any religion, but it's just kind of his interpretation of it, I guess, through the Muslim eyes. So and then obviously in Muslim religion, he's considered to be one of the important people. So is Abraham. So if you guys wanted to join tomorrow at 12 p.m., if anybody has any questions, let us know. If not, we'll end it here. And I want to, wish everybody happy holidays. If I don't see you tomorrow, we do have a holiday party scheduled online the celebration. So you guys, that's coming in on the December 20th, whoever's in New York. You know, I know Howard, you're skiing in Canada right now, so.
Not yet. There's no, it was supposed to be a massive snowstorm on Thursday, but there's no snow.
Howard is covering our, the wall. If you use a Game of Thrones, he's in the, he's a north guy.
On the other side of it, yes.
I just want to thank you all. This was really a fascinating presentation and fascinating comments. So thank you for hosting this.
No,
Thank you very much.
We do many presentations. Like for example, Thursday is our Middle East presentations. We go from Crusades all the way to modern world, to World War II, World War I. Every Thursday, I think it's going to start back up in January. On Saturdays, we usually have Roman and Greek and Middle East and Mediterranean, ancient world. So join on those. Every Sunday we have different subject matters. So we're doing powerful women presentation. We recently did Eleanor of Aquitaine, Catherine the Great, and so forth, so on. And then we have, once in a while, interesting subject matter discussions, some like shamanism, Sufism. That's on Tuesdays every time. So please join those days if you guys want. And hope everybody have a nice holidays and stay warm. Thank you guys.
Thank you.
Okay, all the best.
Thank you.
Take care.
Yep.
Have a
Bye.
happy and healthy.